First of all, it's good to have Donnie and Lori back with us today. Welcome. It's great to have you guys.
It's great to have everybody else here.
Right.
I like him.
I know. Everybody does. You'll find that both Donnie and Lori are very popular. And we have superlatives in the class. We have friendliest, most likely to not succeed. That one's already been given out a couple of times, but we do have a most popular superlative, and you know, I'm not telling you guys to shoot for that, but you should. Blake, you know the one we gave you, of course. Hey, so we're in the book of Daniel. If you have your Bibles, it's very close to where we've been recently. We're going through these the books of some of the major prophets. So today's lesson is chapter 1, and if you know anything about Daniel, you know, even folks that didn't grow up in church, usually they know about Daniel and the lion's den. A lot of them know chapter 1, which is where Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is their Babylonian names. It's not their Jewish names. It's where they get deported, basically. They get taken from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon. And this is this chapter specifically where they decide they don't want to eat the food that the king has prepared for all of the young people that have been deported. And so it's really a story about integrity, and it's a story about tiny choices. And we're going to talk about that, because if you think about all the things that they had to endure, you know, getting ripped from their home in Jerusalem, being deported to Babylon, or really it's the country of, I think, Syria, but it's modern day Babylon, actually it's Babylon, modern day Iraq. And they get basically indoctrinated into this pagan culture. And of all the things that they actually agree to do, change my name, have an education, a Babylonian education, you know, grow up and serve on the king's court, be a government official, the one thing that he balks at is food. And if you think about it, that seems to be a pretty minimal issue with all the other issues that they could have balked at. And so it's a story of integrity, and it's a story of making wise choices even when the choices look small. Because if you're like me, you know, we're pretty good at the big ones, but it's the small ones. And you're going to see today how determined he was, how predetermined he was before this issue even came up. But it made me think about, I read a story recently about the Great Wall of China, and I don't know diddly about the Great Wall of China, frankly, other than it's a big wall. It spans 13,000 miles. That's quite a feat. Built over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, added on to, modified, the whole shebang. But the Chinese originally built the Great Wall of China to protect themselves. Now China doesn't need any protection anymore, but you know, back in 1000 BC, they did. They had these marauding nations that would come and just randomly attack. And the Chinese were not equipped to deal with them, so they built this great wall. And literally, it was a fort. It was designed to protect them. So in 1644, though, they were actually basically conquered by a neighbor nation. And anybody know the story about how they got conquered? About how this nation gained access and actually came in and took them?
Trojan horse.
It's not the Trojan horse. It's not, they didn't breach the wall. You know what happened? One of the Chinese generals was a traitor, and he simply opened the door. He opened the door, and the army came right through. I mean, the wall still stood, but as much effort as they put in the wall, someone didn't think to maybe install integrity as well. And one man who decided he had been bought out and he had no integrity literally opened the door, and this army came through and conquered China for a brief period of time. So it shows what can happen when we don't have integrity, and that's a little opening, by the way, that he opened, and yet it led to the conquering of the nation. So as we think about Daniel, let's put this in perspective. We just came out of Ezekiel. So Ezekiel and Daniel are counterparts. This is all happening around the same time. It's really about 620 BC to about 530 BC. And if you remember, we talked about the fact that, you know, when Solomon reigned in around 950 BC, that's when one of the things that happened with David when David sinned was God told him, he said, your sons are going to betray you, and the kingdom is going to be ripped out. Now, your lineage, you're still going to be in the lineage for Jesus, the Messiah, but your kingdom's going to be torn apart. And shortly after Solomon left his reign, sure enough, Israel and Judah split. Up to that point, it had been Israel. So it split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. North is Israel, southern is Judah, and Jerusalem is in Judah at this time. And so when the Babylonians came and conquered Judah and sieged Jerusalem and did all this damage, this is literally the same time that they took Ezekiel. So in 605 BC, they conquered Jerusalem or attacked Jerusalem and took Daniel and his friends. And one of the things the Babylonians would do is they would take teenagers and they would bring them, they'd go and find the smartest, the best looking, with the highest pedigree teenagers, bring them back to Babylon and indoctrinate them and have them raise up as generals if they were smart enough. And so they did that in 605 BC. Originally, Egypt had attacked Babylon, and in retaliation, they went down and just decimated Egypt. And on the way back, they found out that the Jews had been in cahoots with the Egyptians. And that's the reason they attacked Jerusalem. So they took Daniel and his friends in 605 and 597. They took Ezekiel. And then the last siege where they just cleaned out the city was in 585. So it was over the course of almost, really about 20 years. 3 different stages where they took everybody out. But this is the one, when we think about Daniel, they were the first to go. He and his 3 friends who became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And of course, the other big story that you'll hear in Daniel, the lion's den, this story is pretty popular and pretty well known. And of course, being thrown into the furnace. That one's coming up. And so all of this is setting the stage, and the book of Daniel is really interesting. First of all, other than Joseph, Daniel had more impact on a foreign nation than anybody else in the Old Testament. Now, Joseph got taken to Egypt and was raised up. He didn't become a pharaoh, but he became first in line, and he basically ran the affairs. Well, the same thing happened with Daniel. He got into such good graces with the king because of his obedience and because of his wisdom and his ability to interpret dreams that he was put in charge of everything. So he had this incredible effect on foreign affairs on this nation, and he and Joseph really are the kind of the forerunners of having that kind of impact and that kind of impact for God. But the book of Daniel is interesting because it's 12 chapters and it's literally split down the middle. The first 6 chapters are a narrative, and this is where the stories we're familiar with come from. This story, the furnace, Daniel in the lion's den, these all come in these first 6 chapters. And then lo and behold, chapters 7 through 12 is all prophecy and visions. And it's where Daniel, much like the book of Revelation, in fact, a lot of the things of Revelation come from Daniel. Jesus himself quoted Daniel. He said, he's talking about the end of times, and he actually says, as it's written in the book of Daniel. So these last 7 chapters, when we get to those, it's all prophecy. And it's all end times. A lot of it had to do with just before Christ came, here's what's going to happen, the birthing pains, if you will, of Christ's arrival. But it also speaks very vividly about the end times. And Daniel had a vision of heaven. And so the book is split into those two sections, and it's just really interesting the way it's set up. So this chapter, let me just kind of read through it. I'm going to read the entire chapter, but it's a narrative, so it's easy to follow. So anyway, here goes. Chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. That means some of the holy things, like some of the gold and the silver and the things they considered. Not that they worshiped those, but those were in the temple. And so he took some of those. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his god, little god, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his little god. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that he ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of those 3 years, they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names, Babylonian names. Daniel became Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azaziah was called Abednego. Here comes verse 8. So what we just saw was the story of Babylon comes and conquers Jerusalem. They take a bunch of things from the temple that the Jews consider to be holy items, and they took a bunch of the youth, and they described, we're looking for young people, young men that are smart, that are good looking, that are trainable, and that frankly we can raise up to be government officials in our land. If you think to yourself, well, why don't they have their own folks? Well, yeah, but if you're going to conquer the world, you know what you want? People from all these nations working for you, working right there for you. You want to indoctrinate them so that when we go and conquer their people, you have an insight. You have an inside track to what's actually going on when you enter into Judah and conquer the whole thing, or when you enter into Samaria, or you enter into, wherever the case may be. So, and then it talks about the fact that he's going to educate them, he's going to change their names, and they're going to eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. But here it is. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. That key right there, by the way, Daniel resolved, that simply means he'd already made up his mind. He'd already decided what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable. And when they're being taken to Babylon, he already knew the things they were going to do. And for whatever reason, what I would think would be a biggie, where he'd draw a line and say, no, would be the education, the indoctrination into the culture. How about changing your names? Hey, we want to change your name. You know what? I think that's a bit much. But of all the things that were taking place that were permanent and big things, he chose the food. And it said he resolved himself not to defile himself with the food. Now, if you think, okay, so what was it about the food that would defile him? Well, first of all, it's not kosher. And the Jews have a big deal with kosher food, a really big deal. God gave them explicit ways to kill an animal and how to eat it. He gave them explicit things about what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. And again, the thing is not God saying, being this ornery, dietitian in the sky. He's saying, listen, I'm going to set you apart. And part of setting you apart is actually telling you and teaching you how to properly eat. I mean, if you think about it, this is how big a deal it is to the Jews, and it should be to us too, to a degree. The very first sin in Scripture had to do with food. The very first sin. The fall of man had to do with food. It's a big deal to God. It really is a big deal to God. But it says, Daniel resolved that he wouldn't defile himself with the king's food. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king. He's talking about the king of Babylon, who assigned your food and your drink. For why would he see that you were in worse condition than the other youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king? You understand what he's saying? Daniel had asked him, can we eat a different diet? And he's like, hey man, if the king sees you and you're not as healthy as these others, because we're giving them the best food, the best wine. They are eating at the king's table. They're having the very best of the best. And he's saying, and if the king notices something different about you and finds out that I allowed you to go rogue and have have a special diet, this is the same king who took a king of Judah, not Jehoiakim, but the one previous to him. He murdered his sons in front of him while he was in chains and then gouged his eyes out so that the last memory he had would be seeing his sons murdered. This is also the same king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who spit roasted Judah's officials in front of the entire country. And basically gathered the crowd and said, and here are your officials, put them on a spit and burn them to death. Burn them alive over a spit. So this is the kind of king that this guy's talking about. He's saying, hey man, I don't know if you know who this guy is, but listen, he's done far worse to people for far less than disobeying an order. So that's why he's upset and why he's really, he's very hesitant. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of these other youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So he listened to them in this manner, and he tested them for 10 days. He basically said, give it a trial. He said, the king ain't going to see us for 10 days, so you do your own little, experiment here. We got a little control group, and we're going to run a little test. And so we're the control group, and we will eat vegetables and drink water, and at the end of 10 days, you make up your own mind. No harm, no foul. King won't see us yet. So he agrees to that. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables. In other words, he let them stay on that diet forever. They went back to, he said, yeah, you're right. When it says fatter, it means that they were more fit. It actually means that they were... Are those reading glasses, or did you get glasses? Did, Harry Potter called and he'd like them back. I'm so sorry. They look good. No, Jordy, they look good. I know a lot of women that look great in those glasses. Verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, this is 3 years later, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like these 4. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus, which is an 80-year period. Daniel was probably 75-year period. Daniel, we think, was probably, he and the other guys were probably 15 or 16. So he spent 75 years here in Babylon. He saw 3 different kings come into power. And he ended up with King Cyrus. The Syrians actually came in, or what became Persia, and defeated the Babylons. And yet he stayed in this government role. And so all of this time, he's in this role. And it says here that everything started with this first decision about food. It dictated everything that happened after that. Now, that's not insinuating that had he not made that decision, that none of this would have taken place. God's sovereign. God would have brought everything to fruition regardless. But he made a tiny choice that had this ripple effect for 75 years that set the tone for everything. I mean, follow me on this logic here. Again, being indoctrinated into this pagan culture, all these things you can object to. Not only did he bring up food, think about the way he asked about it. He could have, thrown a hissy fit and jumped out of the sandbox and said, we're not doing that. Instead, he went to the guy that's in charge of everything, and he used respect, and he used compassion, and he used kindness, and he used logic. How about this? Test us for 10 days. No harm, no foul. No one will even know. And the guy was like, I will do that. I will do that. And it said God gave him favor, and when they brought him before the king after 3 years, because they'd stayed on this diet, and God had given him more and more wisdom and understanding, that when they stood before the king, and they think that they probably paraded hundreds by the way. This wasn't like the 4 of them and then there's 6 others over here. There's probably hundreds of young men that had been taken and deported, and for some reason, a God reason, these 4 stood out like a sore thumb, but in a great way. They were heads and tails. It says they were 10 times smarter than the enchanters and the magicians. Now, Babylon, the Babylonians would use, it's not magicians like I'm pulling a rabbit out of the hat. These are these are basically soothsayers and fortune tellers. And you think about what God had to say about that. God is like, hey man, don't mess with that stuff. That's the occult. And you're messing with a spiritual battle. Don't do that. God is really serious about having your palm read or having your tea leaves read or anything that looks into the darkness of the spiritual world, trying to figure out if you can make contact with the next world. What does the future hold for me? God says, I'll take care of all of that. When you go to that, you're not going to some lady out on Highway 78 that's making $25 an hour, you're going straight to the pits of hell, and you're asking a spiritual question that you shouldn't be asking. Well, that's what the Babylonians did. But what the king would do is he'd find the smartest people and assume that they could be magicians. So when it says that they were 10 times smarter and had more understanding than these magicians and enchanters, it means they were the ones who supposedly had the look of the future. They're the wisest of the wise, and these guys were so far ahead of them. And by the way, at this time, they're 18 years old. The people they're talking about are probably in their 30s and 40s. So they stood out like a sore thumb, but everything started with that first resolvement that he resolved. He made up his mind in advance. So, I actually mentioned, why was the sticking point food? It had been sacrificed to idols. The Jews knew that the very first sin was the sin of food. It did imply if you ate at the king's court, it doesn't mean the king's at the other end of the table, but you're eating in his court and you're eating his food, it's an implication that I'm good with all of this. It's the way they treated food and the way they treated festivals in those days. If you attended, voluntarily, it was complicity. You were saying, I'm good with everything that's going on. So those were some things. But let me ask you this. Knowing what you know about the story, and just fire these out. I mean, I'm not asking rhetorically. What excuses could he have made? How could he have justified, yeah, we're going to eat the food? What are some things he could have said? Because he didn't do that, but he could have. What if he'd have just looked at the other three and said, I got to tell you, we better, toe the line here, we better get in line with these folks. What are some excuses he could have used?
Survival.
What's that?
Survival.
That's absolutely correct. Survival.
Mandate.
What's that? That's right. That's right. They also had to wear a mask. You're going to eat the king's food and you're going to wear a mask. It's a government mandate. They're telling, hey, listen, we're here and it's mandated. Hey, if we don't do it, are we going to survive? How about this one? No accountability. We're not in Jerusalem. And by the way, I could go off on, the fact that these four likely had phenomenal parents. You think about the four kind of young men they are, they didn't just happenstance, willy-nilly grow up to be these kind of young men. So, but guess what? Their parents aren't around to tell them what to do. Here are teenagers, they're probably afraid for their survival. They're a long way from home. It's like college. Man, I'm at college, I can do whatever I want. My parents have no earthly idea, and by the way, I'm not even in the state of Alabama. The chances of me seeing anybody from my hometown here, nil. So there's no accountability. There's survival. By the way, can't we all just get along? Yes, I'll compromise. Who wants to rock the boat? Hey, listen, there's hills to die on, and there are hills not to die on, but as Christians, we should discern the difference, and it's better to die on a hill for your faith than to slink away and compromise. That's a big difference. And so, all of these things. How about this one? This is the one that resonated with me, quite frankly. Do you think they could have been bitter against God for letting this happen in the first place? How about that one? I got ripped away from my family and friends. I'm out here in Yahooville with these Babylonians. They've even changed my name. The food thing, I'll tell you what. Yeah, and by the way, the food looks great. This isn't just a buffet. This is like an endless buffet of the best of the best of the best. And I got to tell you, God, maybe I deserve this after what you just did to me. I mean, how many times in our life do we make decisions on the bitterness that we hold ultimately against God or against someone else? Well, I'll tell you what, I'll show them. And so all of these things were working against him. The second point I wanted to make, though, is we've got a few more minutes. Notice in verse 9, it says in verse 8, but Daniel resolved, and then in verse 9 it says, and God gave Daniel favor. There's a pecking order there. It doesn't say God gave Daniel favor and then he resolved. It said he made up his mind. Lynn, we talk about this a lot. What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. Have y'all heard that? We've been saying it, fairly frequently. What the heart loves, the will choose. Hey, this is actually who I am and what I love, and I'm going to do this. And then, by the way, I'm going to justify it somehow. All of these things he could have justified it with. I got to tell you, that food looks fantastic. And by the way, now I do love the food. I'm also mad at God, and therefore I'm going to act on my will, and I'll justify it by saying all the things we just said. I'm afraid I'm not going to survive. It's a government mandate. I'm a long way from home. You know, all of these things. But God honors those who are obedient to him. But there's a pecking order. Our obedience comes before his honoring. You know, 1 Peter 1, or 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7 says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of the Lord, and he will lift you up, or actually that means honor you in due time. Now, the key there is due time. There are actually people, and it's the health wealth people, to be honest with you, that will look at this passage and say, okay, he did something and God honored him. God gave him all this stuff, gave him wealth, gave him wisdom, gave him understanding, gave him a great job. And they'll say, see, when you do something, God is going to do something for you. But this story happened to work out that way. In fact, they continue to work out that way. They get thrown into the furnace. I'm not spoiling anything for anybody. They get thrown in the furnace, they get delivered out. He gets thrown in the lion's den, he gets delivered out. So yes, God acted immediately in this story, but when verse Peter says, in due time, that means we may never see it here. And I got news for all of us. When we get to heaven and see Jesus face to face, the goofy crap that we would like to have here that we felt like God owed us will seem like a distant memory. It won't even measure. Man, I didn't get that job. I had to eat through my retirement. We got so sick and we did. I'm not minimizing hurt and pain, but what I'm saying is, God honors and lifts people up, and the ultimate in due time is our salvation. And we should always focus on that. It'd be great if he gave us all wisdom and understanding. We had great jobs and we were, powerful in this. But guess what Daniel did with all of it? He continued to honor God and obey him. Same with Joseph. Joseph didn't get to the top of the rung and then turn around and go, God, thank you so much, have a Coke and a smile, and now I'm off on my own. He lived for the Lord, and the Lord in return lifted them up in due time. By the way, Joseph's took a while. He didn't have the happy, coming out of the gate like Daniel did. Last time we checked, he was in prison. He was being accused of things. His life was on the line. So it just, it's a great example of, this doesn't, in due time, is in God's due time. And I think that's one of the most difficult things in life, is understanding that our timing is not his timing. Of course, our ways and thoughts aren't his, but our timing. Do you ever get tired of waiting for something? And you start tapping your spiritual foot and you're like, come on, man, let's get this thing going. I am twisting on a vine here. Let's get this thing going. So anyway, as we kind of close out, here's a couple of lessons. The world continually tries to reprogram us into a different way of thinking. And again, this goes back to the point that there's a battle for your mind. There's a spiritual war battle for your mind going on every minute, every day. And that's why little choices make a difference. You always hear death by 1,000 cuts. Well, that's what that means. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. All of these things are just simply saying it's little things that add up. So and this is a biggie. We must make up our minds in advance that we'll be loyal to God. In advance. Now, when our kids were teenagers, we taught them, or we tried to instill in them, that we're going to make decisions about lifestyle now. You're not going to get in a back seat with a girl and then decide, it's time to figure out, buddy, that ship has sailed. It's hormones ahoy, and you're going to get thrown overboard. So we make that decision in advance. We go to a party on Friday night. Doesn't mean you can't go to a party, but when we go to that party, we've made a decision in advance. When someone hands us a joint or a beer or whatever, we're not going to go, oh, what am I going to do here? Because listen, if we wait to make decisions like that, 90% of the time we give in. See, Daniel resolved. I don't know when he resolved. Maybe it's when they were in chains being taken to Babylon. But at some point he said, there are certain things I will do that the Lord is telling me it's okay. And there are certain things that I will not do. And so we have to make those decisions in advance.
Can I just expand on that with the teenagers? When we talk to our kids about making that decision, we would do something that was uncomfortable at the time, but they need examples. We would do dialectal behavioral therapy is really what it is. What that means is we would talk about, let's role play this. Let's see what it looks like. So I could throw things at them, because they may have resolved in their mind that I'm not going to do this, but then it's real weird when you're also telling them what to say at a party. So we would say, okay, if this happens, what do you say? Okay, you're not cool, you don't want to be with us, and then make them come up with it. So that it just takes it a step further to help role play them, because they need help. I even need help.
I was always the stoner who was trying to give them a doobie.
Yes, Mark was
Yes.
and I was always the angel that was telling them, come on, my son.
Right.
It was, we didn't go that far, but.
Well, and it kind of goes back to, Scripture never mentions their parents, but these guys resolved in advance what they were going to do. And 15 years old. I don't know many 50-year-olds that make these kind of decisions with that kind of resolve. We must know our limits, and we got to know what's right and wrong. And finally, death by 1,000 cuts. It's such a small area. There are no small areas for God. And one of the beauties of Scripture is that, you have a David and Goliath story every once in a while, and you have a, parting the Red Sea, shabam, some of these big stories. But the Bible is basically a complete end-to-end narrative of little people who really were just ordinary like us, doing mighty things because of a mighty God, but in small increments. It matters. This past Monday, I don't know why I'm going to tell this, but it matters. The decisions we make, the decisions you make when you're 18, when you're 20, when you're 22. We were coming back from the beach Monday, and Lynn and Leslie Travis were sitting in the back seat, and Doug, Lynn's brother, and I were sitting in the front. And for some reason, Doug and I have been very close for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. I mean, really close. I don't even think about him like a brother-in-law. I think about him as one of my best friends. But he'd never really heard my testimony about when I went to Tampa and everything that happened down there and what I did and all of that. And I was telling him about how Lynn and I actually got back together, because we had been friends in high school. And we came to Birmingham. I came back from Tampa. She came from Atlanta to a mutual friend's wedding. And afterwards, we just went and sat in the car all night long till like 4 in the morning and just talked. And when I was in high school, I was happy-go-lucky. Everything's good. I wasn't the life of the party, but I sat next to the guy that was the life of the party, and I took notes. When I sat in that car with her, she said to me, about halfway through, because here's the deal, I didn't know I was going to marry her. I didn't know. So I told her everything. I mean, literally, I pulled the curtain back on everything I'd done. And she just looked at me crying, and she said, I don't know who you are. She goes, I don't know who you are. I don't know you. And when I said that to Doug last week, coming in the car, I burst out crying. And I have no reason why. I mean, I literally erupted. Because in it stirred in me all of these horrible decisions I had made and the ramifications they've had on my life and on the life of my wife. Now, we're standing here today, but I exploded because I thought, man, and instead of saying, God, thank you, I got stuck in the moment and thinking, I'm a horrible person. I just can't believe that I did all that, and it just triggered. I got triggered on it. So I say all that to say these little choices matter. I don't think there's a person in here, if you couldn't go back to your teenage years, wouldn't do not just something different, probably would do everything different. I certainly would. I still struggle with, the concept of AA and 12 steps. One of the things is you got to go find the people you've harmed and ask them for forgiveness. I still struggle with that. I'm like, I don't know how to find these people, but I got to find them somewhere. And by golly, there's so many of them, I don't even know where to start. So that pain, that guilt, that, it's low self-esteem, but that all comes, first of all, from the pits of hell, but then it also comes from these choices we make. This guy made a tiny choice on the surface when he was 15 years old, and for the next 75 years, it radically changed his life. This one choice. It's amazing. So as you go through what I'm asking you to do, and what I'm asking myself as we go through today and this week, you're going to be faced with just a lot of little choices, but resolve in advance what you're going to do. Don't make it up as you go along. This is a great passage. It teaches us so much. But again, what the heart loves, the will choose, and the mind will justify. If we love Jesus, we're going to choose to be obedient, and we really don't even have to justify it other than to say thank you. So I hope you guys, have, I just burped. Sorry about that. By the way, this is too much information. We were downstairs with the kids this
Dear
morning.
heavens, Don't.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh.
As you
It's nice
can.
to have somebody keep you in check.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Nope, you're right.
But it wasn't the attic, it was the basement downstairs. Don't y'all ever say that? Some of your birds say better the attic than the basement. Don't ever say that. You never say that?
Even the small toddlers downstairs were like, Mommy, what's that smell? What happened? Is there a dead chipmunk somewhere close? Hey, Webb, I know I'm troubled you with this, but would you mind closing some prayer? Please. Thank you, buddy.
God, you're so good. That we stand in awe of your holiness, your grace, your love. We're grateful. Grateful that you love us so much. As undeserved as